It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Steve Sjogren, and we're going to be discussing his book, The Day I Died, an unforgettable story of life after death. Steve, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shaun. Good to be with you too, man.
Well, and I'm always a little hesitant to ask my origin story question because we're going to talk about a bunch about your life and story, but we're going to go there anyways. Just in terms of elevator pitch origin story, this is the first time somebody's meeting you. Give us a little bit of context for your work and ministry. What are a few things we need to know about you?
Yeah, one is I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, moved in high school to Arizona, went to Scottsdale High School, which does not exist any longer, and ended up coming to the Lord. Right after that, I got a scholarship to live in Norway, in north of the Arctic Circle, actually, which is kind of a contrast to the Phoenix area. And so lived there for a year, got pretty good at Norwegian for one. And during that year, began to read the Bible. I like to say I read myself to Christ because there wasn't a whole lot of input. But I began to read the New Testament over and over and over again, and really was drawn by the Holy Spirit, of course, and amazing. Moved back to the Phoenix and ended up hearing about the Jesus movement in California, which Jesus Revolution movie, which has come out in the last year, captures that fairly well, I think, especially the part about Lonnie Frisbee, by the way. If you have seen the movie, he was a friend and, incredible. So that whole thing began to, it was more like the blob in the movie. It's a blob where it just picks up people in its path, draws them in, and hey, he's getting me too, And there's just something going on, and especially in Southern California, where you couldn't have enough services at a church, even a big church, and so ended up the Vineyard spun out of that in the mid '70s. I began to hang out, finished college, ended up just at a point where I'd never met the guys who started it, but I thought I'm going to write him a letter and ask if I could become an intern. It's totally crazy. And the guy who actually started the Vineyard, Ken Gullickson, who teamed up with John Wimber, of course, later on, so you guys know those names. And he said, yeah, come on board. So I spent 2 years there with my wife, Janie, learned how to do church planting from experience versus theory. And to speed it up, went from there, planted in Oslo again, went back to Norway, went from there to Baltimore, helped a friend plant there, and then came to Cincinnati, where this is a maybe more interesting part of the story, where we started with 5 people, and 3 of the people were kind of disturbed. And so it's not like your ideal 5 people. It's they're wonderful people, but a little bit difficult to get to know, put it that way. And so we just, worked and kept doing Bible studies. And one day I was driving a bus. It was one of my 3 jobs. I drove a bus, I did bookkeeping, and I drove a truck, all the above. And ended up that I'm in the parking lot of the bus barn, as they call them. And it's literally right around 0 and the wind is blowing. So you get the idea of how cold it was. I'm complaining to God and shelving my way across the parking lot. And I had this hat that looked like Elmer Fudd, with the hunting for wabbits. Yeah, right, exactly. You get the idea. And so I'm walking across the parking lot, and I'm complaining, God, I did not sign up to do this for, at that time, 18 people or something on a good Sunday. And he says, the problem is 2 things. One is you are boring. If you do what Jesus did, you'll figure out the things that are important. And we figured out there's 30-something things Jesus did. And that was incredibly helpful to get that point of reference. And then he said, you're praying for a microphone. And the truth is I've given you a toilet brush. That's a heavy duty word. And it wasn't to clean my toilet only, put it that way. And, but to begin to go in the community, we call that heroic levels of outreach. When you clean, not an individual, but a restaurant or a gas station, there's lots of places. And I love going to AA headquarters in various cities. And those guys really are often getting it. They may not be believers, but they get it, the whole toilet cleaning thing. Lots of toilet stories I could tell you, but we'll stop there. And that's kind of my background. The church grew, by the way. After 10 years, we had about 4,500 on weekends. And so it grew in 10 years from just a handful to 4,500. And honestly, I think anybody who knows the story would say the the flywheel at the core of the whole thing was this outreach mentality and being a go and do church, you know.
Yeah, we talked about this before starting this interview, and I had listened to a podcast you did a number of years back where you went at length into a lot of your toilet brush stories and other things. I really enjoyed hearing about your adventures in Cincinnati, which has its own unique culture. I learned that if I ever go back, I need to I shouldn't say please because people will just keep repeating themselves.
Absolutely. They'll keep asking you the same thing over and over again, please. Okay. That's a
uh,
synthetic joke, guys. You have to go there
yeah.
and figure.
Yeah, I'll try not to even say please. I just you'll feel like you have to repeat yourself in the interview. One of the things I always kind of like to establish is what was the length of time between when you had your NDE to when you actually I guess two part between that and when you ever started sharing about it publicly and then when you wrote a book because I just in the past 3-4 years I've met so many people who've had near death experiences and I know for many of them their experience is their most precious thing, one of their most precious experiences with God, and they're hesitant to even share it because it's so personal and so intimate. And so everybody has kind of a different path and a story in terms of how they get comfortable to where they can actually share it. So I would love to hear just understand that timeline before we get into the story.
Yeah. The What happened is in right around Christmas of '97 is when my accident happened. I call it an accident, though. When you hear the incompetency in a minute here, you'll go, not really. And the book came out, I believe, in 2000. So it's about 2 years later. And I was a little hesitant because there was some legal stuff still going on, and they didn't want me to write a book. And I said, I'll write one anyway. So did it, and it's been very popular. And really appreciate you being on today, Shaun, by the way. Thank you.
Well, I love talking about NDEs, so truly my pleasure. In terms of setting the stage, like give us kind of that day in the life, like what was going on, life, ministry, where were you at, why were you going in for a surgery, just uh give us that week in the life before you went in for your procedure.
Okay. Um, the I was incredibly busy, I should say. Uh, Looking back now, I wonder how much of it was God inspired and how much was Steve's strength. But in that middle of traveling a lot, I was due to go to Africa, at Kenya, I think it was, and then also to Australia. And thinking about it, one evening before the whole thing came together, my midsection hurt tremendously. I mean, I had to double over for the pain. And I thought, that's weird. I didn't do anything stretching my muscles or anything. And about a week later, it happened again, uncommenced by me. Went to my family doctor. He says, sounds like a gallbladder. And so he sends me to this really good surgeon who I go over there to the surgeon. I noticed, I won't go into too much detail, but he had tattoos on each wrist, which I'm not against tattoos at all. My kids have them. But turns out it was a dragon on his back. I mean, you have to spend a lot of time to get that much of a tattoo. So in the new book I'm writing, thank you very much. I nickname people I call it the High Hopes Hospital. It's kind of like the old, but they've got high hopes. That whole song. And but it's kind of at this point I think it'll be a helpful book. But anyway, super busy going to see the doctor. He sends the test back. I did 5 different tests. I can't even remember all, CAT scans and MRIs, and even did the sonogram like they do with pregnant women. We can't find your gallbladder anywhere. It's around there somewhere, we know. And I read the synopsis by the radiologist after seeing all the tests. And basically what he said was, we can't see the gallbladder, but we all know that everybody has a gallbladder. And so it's there, probably impacted somewhere. They get into the surgery, and this is me knocked out and everything. Figure out pretty quickly that they had hit my belly button part of the aorta. Your aorta is about the thickness of your thumb. Each person's a little different, of course. and they somehow hit the top and the bottom with a instrument made by Johnson and Johnson. Thank you very much, J&J. And this you probably can do some TV. People get upset about the companies, whatever. I don't think it was their fault. It was incorrectly shot into me. They do little teeny cuts about like this, and they put lights in and lights, camera, action, and they da 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 da. Well, my blood pressure went down to 30/10, and it stayed there for an hour and 15 minutes. One of my doctors later on said 30/10 is the blood pressure of a sponge, not a human. And they were amazed my heart kept going because I was defused of blood completely. They had no one there that could stitch a fine stitch on a artery. It's kind of a learned thing you have to do. Yeah, not everybody can do it. And as he's getting in the car to drive away, he hears his name on the PA of the parking lot. Stat, get in here right now. He's the guy that saved my life for sure. But I'll jump ahead slightly in the story. I don't even have a gallbladder. I was alluding to that a little bit there. Every between 30 and 50,000 people, one person will be born without a gallbladder. And that is a whole lot of people that do have a gallbladder.
They had so much faith that it was going to be there and they were going to find it.
Yes, they were in their own tests. I'm going, what the world? But it was, yeah, go ahead.
Keep going. You wanted to jump a little bit forward ahead. I'll get us reoriented after you kind of finish your train of thought.
Okay, good. Ended up that I, not to get too graphic here, I was in England a while back, and they have a lower level of capacity for graphicness, and people are going like this. And I'm going, okay, I'm going to tone it down a little bit. Here's the American version, is they ended up replenishing my entire blood, the numbers of units three times. And that went on for, again, I'm profusely bleeding, which, by the way, took a while to figure out what was going on. They thought I had either a heart attack or a stroke or something because the blood pressure was so low, and it was hard to find it. They said anyway. So ended up that I was in there for hours and hours and hours being reconstructed, I guess. My wife was told after waiting for 3 or 4 times longer than they said it would be, they finally came out and said, there's been an irregularity. She goes, yeah, I guess so. She hears the story. And she went into the women's restroom and lay prostrate on the floor and said, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. And we've always said that, the Holy Spirit is moving mightily, but you have to get down to the 18-inch level to pick up on it. And so she began to think, maybe he could still live, kind of thing. And jumping ahead, that first night I woke up, I was chained to both my hands and my legs. They said later on that I was still knocked out and I was trying to pull everything out. It's very uncomfortable to not be able to breathe on your own. And the first thing that hit me as I woke up was, I am not in heaven. This is definitely not heaven. And then I couldn't talk, of course, and I'm writing on a piece of paper that unchained my one wrist, I guess. And what in the world? And it's going to be okay, Steve. It's going to be okay. And jumping, I can tell you the rest of the story slightly. Was moved to another hospital. It was a trauma unit that is regionally known, an incredibly together trauma unit. It took 6 hours to unplug me and to get me into the vehicle to take me 20 minutes away. And Janie said it was unbelievable. There's just so many little things and 4 people at times working on you. Yeah, I get a little bit emotional talking about how committed those guys were. And another part of the story, which is, I'm not sure we can even get into it, but there was I call it a makeshift volunteer medical experts that showed up from our board, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know what in the world was going on, but they recommended I stay at the hospital. And okay, go ahead. Okay, that's the head of the story, the forgiveness part. But anyway, Janie said, we are not going to leave him here. He will not be alive by the morning. And the doctors that saved me said, you wouldn't have made it maybe 18 hours, something like that. And wow. I get a little bit emotional even thinking about it. But yeah, that's the big high points I could say.
Yes, high
There's a lot
points.
of parts that happened when I died that I could see and
Sure,
hear. But
sure. Uh, in terms of heart stopping brain activity, did your heart ever stop, or did you have brain function cease, or was that ongoing even though you had such catastrophic blood loss?
the heart stopped for several minutes. Um, they had, when they do a high risk thing like that, where especially they see difficulty, they will tilt. They call it a Trunlenberg, I think it's called, where the head is down and the feet are up. So hopefully protect the brain at all costs. And they did. I did die for several minutes and revived, of course. But my gosh, it was just totally duct tape on a car wreck kind of thing. It wasn't very effective, but it worked for a few minutes anyway.
Well, and now we're going to get into the experimental part of this interview where we will attempt to finish telling Steve's story through the lens of the 9-point NDE framework that Randy and I introduced in our book Near Death Experiences. So we've kind of already gotten into what I would typically term gateway to the afterlife, where it's an accident, a medical incident, something really bad happens, and you move towards transitioning to the other side. For context, in terms of when you died, that was during the surgery, correct? Okay. And then uh, when you died, did you have any kind of an out of body experience before you like to talk to us about that? Just and I'm all these are some of these are very minor and not exciting, and other people spend a lot of time playing around in this in between environment before they kind of cross over the veil, or go through the veil, if you will.
Yeah.
Tell us about your out of body experience, what that looked like.
Well, part of it was what I heard, parts what I saw, and the first thing I was aware, kind of an awareness, was it sounds weird, but I could feel what I thought was the ceiling. It was a room. I come to find out, it was very accurate. That had I beams that were not gigantic, but small I beams across it. That was what I felt, and as I was there looking down, it was clear that there was a emergency going on and on. I mean, there's a lot of, and I could see that I was the same color as the sheet, pretty much, gone. And but it's funny. I didn't feel really afraid at that point. And in fact, this whole story, I didn't feel afraid. I get more confidence in just a minute here. But what I heard at the time was the music of Led Zeppelin, and it wasn't "Stairway to Heaven." Everybody asked that. No,
That would have been wonderfully ironic if it was.
well, yeah, I don't remember which song it was, but I knew the album cover. And later on, I asked two of the nurses who actually went to our church. I didn't know them, but they came to our church. At that point, a lot of people were coming. Da, da, da. So they they said later on, "Oh, he's known for loving Led Zeppelin. He plays it really loud." That surgeon. It's kind of their choice of music, if you or the surgeon. So just amazing. I'm going, well, this is weird. I can hear that. Well, it kind of shifts at that point, and I can see let me shift back. I can hear, better way to put it, these words: "Don't worry, you'll live. Don't worry, you'll live." And again, yeah, I think in the other side, I'm not sure if you have to hear it or if you think it and you know it at that moment. But clearly that was what came into my noggin. Don't worry, you'll live. Well, here's the funny thing, Shaun, is that here I am at age 42. I just had my birthday just shortly before that. And I'm hearing a line from a play I was in high school. I was the doctor and miracle worker with the whole story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. At the very beginning, both in the movie, if you see it, I just saw it recently again. Um, I think I had a pretty good Alabama accent. And my whole thing is I look up from the crib, the whatever it is, and I go to the parents, "Don't worry, she'll live." See, again, was not a great accent, I think so. But anyway, so there we are. I'm hearing this years later. I'm getting chills again here. How many people on the planet have been the doctor in that play and would later on? I mean, it's just staggeringly, I might be one in the ever kind of thing. And so there we are. At that point, I was already feeling relief. I don't think I'm going to die completely, but I began to realize is that God was drawing me forward, if you will, and so it was kind of like this thing. I felt a life, they call it a life examination, I guess, things
Sure.
I've done wrong, things
Can
I
I can
done.
I pause you for a second, Steve, with
Please.
a
Yeah.
couple of clarifying questions?
Yes.
So in terms of seeing yourself in surgery, did you realize right away that it was you? I mean, sometimes people aren't sure, but they're like, "This is weird," and like, "Oh, that's me." Did you know it was you right away?
Not by sight, but I knew in my heart it was. Again, I just, to me, boom, so much intuition. I didn't need to be told. It was kind of boom, yes. And I didn't see myself, but I saw this again, this body. You know,
Sure, sure. And in terms of you had mentioned feeling a sense of relief. I mean, on the one hand, what you just said, like once you are kind of moving towards being untethered from the physical body, you often just know things, and communication is instantaneous, and it's just a whole everything's dialed up to 11, if you will. But
I would
you
agree.
sense so heightened senses are often the norm at this stage. But in terms of you said something a moment ago about a sense of relief. Like a lot of people who go through something catastrophic or they're very sick, they'll talk about when they enter into their out of body experience, like, this is great. I felt better than I felt in a long time. Describe that sense of relief. What was that like?
Well, as I'm looking down, what I become aware is this is kind of serious stuff. But at that same moment, it was like, here's a bigger voice, here's a bigger realization. You are going to live. And so there was a relief. I'm kind of a nervous person in general, and that goes with the ADD thing, I think. But in general, I can be talked into getting nervous pretty quickly. And at that point, I felt this, I like a wet blanket of positivity that God was putting on me, like, hang in there, kind of thing.
And then a little bit ago, you talked about kind of being pulled forward. People sometimes describe like moving towards the ceiling or being pulled up, if you will. Did you see any kind of a tunnel or bright light? That's often typical at this stage of the journey.
What I saw was two things. One was that life review, I guess we could call it, and it was like a red. I remember it actually being like a red thing and like a light, cha-chink, and I was instantly weighed in the balance, if you would. And what came to me, Shaun, is that I need to take my friends seriously. My there's so many things that I've not done really well, and I'm gonna make an empowered effort. God give me strength, and I'm gonna be a different kind of a person. And it wasn't like I'm going to hell in a handbasket kind of thing, like a Grateful Dead song at all. But it was really a deal where God, I really want to do my best for you and what you're up to. At that point, I drew forward. I was just aware of another thing, Shaun. This might be the most important part of the whole story. I could hear again that voice saying, "Don't worry, you'll live." And it was kind of coming in waves. "Don't worry, you'll live." And it wasn't one voice. It was here's a big word, cacophony of voices, and men's, women's, children, accents galore. And as I looked at it more carefully, "Don't worry, you'll live." It was like a giant sunflower. And if we raise sunflowers, and you can get over 1,000 little things next to each other easily from a big sunflower. And so what I began to realize is that those are actually, each one is a pixel, if you will. That's what I would use to describe in 2024 language. And each one had its own voice, and it was shoulder to shoulder with several. And it was unbelievable. And God was speaking His heart, His mind to me through the uncountable numbers of people. And I'm not sure what that means in this life before we go to be with the Lord permanently, but it sure does mean to me we better get along. We better learn to get along because, I know the humor of God well enough, and you do, perhaps, Shaun, too, is He'll put you right next to that person you cannot stand. And by the power of the Spirit, you're transformed and so forth.
One more question related to your life review. I've heard a lot of people describe that they were able to kind of see, feel, experience from other people's perspective, whether it's people they had hurt or other situations. Did you get any sense of experiencing other people's kind of emotions in ways that you'd impacted them?
No, not really. Not really. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and even with life reviews, like it's very common for somebody to have one in the midst of an NDE, but what they exactly look like, I've not tried to categorize them, but they're not all exactly the same in terms of kind of how it plays out in the midst of the near death experience. Um, did did you encounter any kind of some people talk about coming to the gates of heaven, or some kind of a boundary as they transitioned, any kind of a threshold, gateway, boundary in your experience?
Um, no, no, again, I didn't have that happen to me, but again, I felt like I was drawn in to that undulating, if you will, sunflower, and it was like a magnetic thing. I felt, and it was like this is what it's all about, is this sunflower thing, and loving and hearing and being a part, and repenting and everything that's yeah. Anyway,
Any welcoming committee? I always throw that one out there too. Because some people will be like, "Oh, my grandmother was there, and my three friends that went on before me." But again, not something that happens for everybody.
no, it didn't. And going back to that one part of the story, it might be helpful. I am a movie buff, and of course, only Christian movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger too. And there was one of his Terminator movies. I know some people are getting mad at me right now, but just hang in there. It gets better. Um, and there's a scene in the movie where he needs clothing, and he just sees people at the red light, and he knew instantly their size, their whatever it is, and he was aware, and I felt like I was read by a similar kind of a light, like a red chink chink. In that same show, he knew instantly, and I think it felt to me like I was known instantly, and that has kept me, I think, in a place of humility over the years since then. That I am known more than I ever realized. I am known. There's no hiding.
Yeah, there is that. I often described it as what you might think of as a spirit to spirit, like this, the understanding, the knowing, being known, the knowledge, information. It's just all instantaneous.
Yes.
When we're on that other side, and it's kind of hard to express. I feel like just because we don't really have an earthbound component where that we could quite match up to what that's like. In terms of encountering other beings, angels, members of the Godhead. Some people talk about animals. Some people talk about seeing other people. What are some of the other beings you encountered in your experience?
Here, this is real interesting. Glad you asked that question. Um, I had kind of an extended NDE, I would call it, where part of the whole story was that I was in a coma for a number of days. And in the coma, and I guess this is kind of unusual, I was very aware what was going on around me. I could not move at all. My body needed to be rested and so forth. So it was a good thing. But as I'm in this coma, I'm aware of what's going on around me in the ICU. Again, at this very large ICU, because it's a regional trauma unit. And as I'm there, I become aware of the other people in the circle that had died. I know that sounds weird, but I my around my bed, I saw three people holding hands, interceding for me, and that was at a point where they didn't know if I was going to make it at all. And I was aware, although they didn't look like, they were kind of like transparent, translucent, but they were clearly people. I could tell gender and approximate age and so forth. Well, about that point, I became aware of how they died and which part of the ICU they were found in. And I came to, one of the first things I did was there a 19-year-old kid whose dad is a Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee pastor? And they go, what? And he died in a car wreck the night before. And on it goes. So all three I could name and describe. And it's a weird thing. God shows up in the weirdest ways, and in the ways that we would never think he would. If that was God, he would. I go, well, maybe you need to experience God a little more.
Well, and that's really interesting to me in terms of that you understood how they had died, how they had passed over. I've interviewed other people who've had what you would probably term as more disturbing near-death experiences or hellish near-death experiences, where they'll see people in eternal torment, but in kind of in that same way, they understood what these people had done in their life, why they were in that place, and what was going on. Again, just that it's almost like we're tied into the matrix. Maybe that's the best way I could like you just and you understand, and it's just you barely think and the answer is there, sort of a thing. So that's intriguing. I don't think I've ever heard that quite expressed before, of seeing people interceding who had passed, but you also knew at the same time what their circumstances were. Any other beings you want to clue us into that you may have encountered?
It's part of the story, but I didn't encounter them. I've had two different people tell me that they had seen this and that, and come to me. Does that ring true with you? And probably the best one was a friend of mine flew out from L.A. just to pray for me in Cincinnati. He had never been to Ohio or Cincinnati, and he didn't know the airport is in Kentucky, by the way. So I mean, very like, how do you find your way forward? He just drove around town and saw one hospital. He thought, I'll try that one. That's exactly where I was. And as he's in the doctor's parking lot, which you'll get to very quickly, he goes, I just got to get in there real quickly. And two doctors that were, doctors' garb and so forth, had their names on the jackets and so forth. They're going toward the building. He goes, hey, do you guys know there's a patient, Steve Sjogren? They go, oh, yeah, we'll take you right there. They go in the back door. Turns out later on that for anybody to enter that other than a doctor will be fired on the spot, kind of thing. It's like a huge security issue, I guess. Well, they let him in. You look like a nice guy. Yeah, well, pastor. Oh, perfect. So they bring him in, and he's into my room praying for me. I mean, amazing stuff. What are the chances? Again, he finds the airport, my gosh, the whole thing's amazing. And he's praying for me as he's walking out the door. The head nurse, her name was Cratchit. I don't know if you know that name, right? That's another movie name. But anyway, she says, who are you? Well, I was in there praying for Steve. How did you get in? Da, 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 da. Well, these two doctors? No, no, seriously, how did you get in? It's kind of an amazing story, I think.
In a moment, I want to get to kind of returning to your body, or coming back, so to speak. But any other aspects that you want to throw in there before we transition into later in your story?
Well, one of them is I actually had an encounter with, I think was a bona fide spiritual angel. And I had not slept in 2 days. It's something about my biology. I don't know what it is, but when they gave me sleeping meds, sometimes I get more stirred up. And that happened for 2 days. I had not slept. This nurse shows up. She looks like Whoopi Goldberg and had a similar attitude to the way, and she says, if you don't sleep, you're going to die. And it was like a deal of, oh, it was a shabang. And later on, I asked about the nurse. I described her. She had a distinct kind of hair thing that was going on, cornrow type hair, and a sweater, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, she doesn't work there either. So I don't know what to say. Is that wild?
It sounds like you had angels on assignment all around with everything that was going on. I always get excited to ask the question of kind of returning to your earthbound body. The funny thing is, some people they're like, I just woke up and there I was, and other people like, it was like everything in reverse going down this tunnel. It almost hurt when I came back into my body. So like it ranges from like really boring to extreme circumstances. So I'm curious, Steve, for you, where did you fall in that spectrum with returning back to your body?
I'd probably be more in the first category. I woke up from being conked out for numbers of days, and the first thing I said was actually kind of not very spiritual at all. I said, that CD they've been playing nonstop for the last several days at Christmas it's a Christmas album, the first one by Harry Connick Jr. And I said, I don't dislike him, but please tear that up and throw the trash. I don't want to ever hear those 10 songs ever again. But that was me coming too. I mean, first thing. So not very spiritual, but it was the truth,
And in terms of, I'm intrigued that you wrote your book so soon. Because on the one hand, Dr. Jeffrey Long has been a guest on the show before. His research shows that it takes somebody an average about 7 years to come to terms with their experience. And I always say it's because our brain isn't big enough to hold this heavenly encounter, and it takes time. I've also met enough people where they're 5, 10, 15, 20 years or more past their experience. And there's sometimes even like progressive revelation, as however it works, them processing with the Holy Spirit, where they will understand aspects of their experience that they didn't know what to process or couldn't deal with early on. So in terms of just uh coming to terms, processing, dealing with it, what'd that look like for you?
Shaun, I compare it. I relate to the second category, even though I wrote the book. There's so much more of that it was again like having a dream, but not having context is difficult. It's not a dream, but let's face it, you weren't literally walking on the street to goal, were you? It's imagery and so forth. But I the interesting thing is at about that point, I was trying to focus my thoughts there for a second. I was not able to really process all this. It was like a giant funnel over my head, and it doesn't have water in it. It has some kind of a thickness to it, but it does go down, and eventually get to the point where you are aware of kind of the difficulty of this. And so that has been my case. And I remembered things, uh, honestly, years later. And I'm glad to hear it. To really encourage you. I'd not talked to anybody that had to wait years to get the whole story. And again, part of it is honestly forgiveness thing, because if you look at it, if this hadn't happened, then that would have not happened, and da 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 da. I wouldn't have met the tattooed doctor with the scalpel, So I, so just one of those things, I've had to really let it get down here, process it. So.
And another big follow-up question to that is, talk to us about how did it affect you, in the sense that on the other side of an experience like this, your personalities often shift, or I've met people where they end up getting divorced because they're so different. They can't continue in the career they were in because they just don't care about any of those things before. A good percentage of people end up going into full-time vocational ministries who never thought of hardly darkening the door of the church, let alone becoming a pastor. So even my favorite story, and again, I've done so much content with Randy and have helped him tell his story so many times. My favorite part of his journey is he was an executive and a corporate trainer and all these things, and they did these series of tests to figure out people's personality traits and whatnot in the training that they did. And before his near-death experience, Randy was not an overly empathetic guy. With how he ranked on this very scientific survey, and the quadrant he was in said Randy was not overly loving, empathetic, any of those things. On the other side of his near-death experience, he continued to do training for a time, and he ended up retaking that test at one point, and he ranked someplace completely different, this complete other quadrant. And I can say Randy's one of the most loving and empathetic, kindest men that I've ever met throughout my life. But prior to his experience, that was not how his personality worked out at all in the practical day to day. So for you, marriage, personality, ministry, what things look different on the other side of your experience?
My this is a little bit of a not entirely objective, but it's close. On the Myers-Briggs test, the personality inventory, if you're not familiar with it, introvert, extrovert, and three other categories you can score high or low in. Before this whole thing, are you familiar with it, Shaun, a little bit, Myers-Briggs?
Yeah,
I was an
absolutely.
ENTJ, which is what a executive general, charge the hill, blah, 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 blah. But what about, down the torpedoes, we're charging the hill. And, most mega church pastors, that is very common. It's the way they behave, if not who they really are. And the Myers-Briggs is very good at describing how we behave in life versus who we are. And in the middle of that, I took another test to begin to feel, maybe I've changed. I changed several of the letters. I went from an E to an I, extrovert to an introvert. And I was still very intuitive. That stayed the same. But I went from a thinker to a feeler. And I went from a schedule person, or a J, they call it, to a P. And I read some of these personality things now, and I go, oh my gosh, I have way migrated on the Myers-Briggs. I mean, I've become a different person. And one Sunday I'm speaking, realizing the beginnings of this whole thing, and I was still at the vineyard, and we had 7 services on a weekend. They're all live too, by the way. You begin to think, no wonder he had a gallbladder, which wasn't there aching, So I realized increasingly, I don't really fit here anymore. And in the end, it just wasn't a good mix. It was growing like crazy, on and on it goes. But I had changed. They didn't change, but I had, and I needed to move on, which I did.
And in terms of burden for ministry, burden for the gospel, you were a pastor going into your near-death experience. I've met so many people where they weren't even believers prior to their experience. And on the other side of it, they are some of the most rampant, and I mean that in a good way, just on fire evangelist. Baby, they are going to tell you about Jesus. Like for you, your fire, your zeal for evangelism and ministry, how was that affected by your experience?
Um, it took a few years to get my energy back, honestly. I did the damn the torpedoes thing for a couple of years, and people would call up, "Are you still speaking around?" "Oh yeah, doing great." That's not true at all. I wasn't doing great physically, for sure, emotionally, and when you do that, it affects your spirituality too, of course. And I have recovered, certainly. That's been over 20 years ago. On the other hand, I think there's been permanent change that's happened in my life, and I think that it's all for the better. I feel like I'm being more transparent now than I've ever been. We had a reunion with our early pastors. We had like 25 pastors at one point. When you have that many people, and we got together again, and one table was just telling old Steve stories, how he was an ENTJ jerk, and did I really do that? Oh yeah, remember? Oh yeah, I guess I did do. So, but I've evolved, and I am so happy. I'm so much happier and more effective. My main thing in life, if anybody knows my story, is outreach and doing it through serving people. We call it servant evangelism, and I've cleaned so many toilets around the world, and every one you do is a new story. Like one I get very often is, "I could have sworn I just heard you say you want to clean our toilet, but we know that can't be true because I must be hearing things." You know, and we did say that, and we ended up having this incredible conversation. And anyway, that's become more turbocharged, if anything, since then. And I continue to travel a little bit, but I'm now an old dude, my late 60s, so not quite as much as I was.
Well, I think one of the last things I want to have you speak to, Steve, before we wrap up, is just kind of wrestling with recovery and health effects. I mean, again, I've interviewed so many different people. I have friends who had experiences where they were miraculously healed of all the stuff that gave them their NDE and just went on like it never happened. I have a friend who he has a hand that is deformed from a birth defect. And when he was in heaven, his hand was perfect. But when he came back, his hand was still the same. And he doesn't mind that God didn't heal it. I've got another close friend, Randy, who I've mentioned several times. Because of the things that happened in his near-death experience, he has just catastrophic lung damage. And so he's wrestled with pneumonia. And in fact, right now he's recovering from pneumonia. And that's just been a norm in his life after his near-death experience. And again, you're somebody who's a pastor in the vineyard where we go after healing as a regular part of the day-to-day. So how
For
did you
sure.
kind of wrestle with recovery and after effects? What was that journey like for you?
Well, the I'm more in the Randy category there. I've had I'm trying to count them up here. I've had 7 surgeries since the first one, and a couple to save my life, but then a number since then. And there's still a couple of possibilities. It affected my throat significantly. I've had one surgery in my esophagus, and I have a scar. It's kind of gruesome, but it's from my mid sternum down to my pelvis, and my belly button is now an inch and a half to the side. And I was teasing the doctor. I said, maybe I should get no belly button. And he goes, you might change your mind later. We'll keep that. Like a tattoo, but way worse, So we we left it like it was, but it's just kind of funny. You see the extreme zipper. And you know the story about the belly button, and you go, my gosh, I'm so grateful to be alive. But there's still problems with my legs. Somehow the low blood pressure affected my legs. I have a neuropathy, they call it. It's like a tingling in your feet usually, but mine is my legs down to my ankles. And it's not as severe as some people for sure, but it's very noticeable. And I can walk okay. I'm kind of limited how much I can walk, how far. But the bigger deal is my legs are still fairly weak, and 2 or 3 times a day, you probably had a time where your knee goes like this, and yeah, it happens 3 times a day to me, ballpark. And if you aren't careful, you're gonna hit the deck, you know. So anyway, those are the main things.
And in terms of reader takeaway, if we're talking about somebody reading your book or, just from this conversation or when you share your story, I find more often than not, people will fixate on this part of your encounter. Like it's interesting how we'll just gravitate towards one specific thing. What do you want people to hear when you share your story? Like what is the takeaway, the message? Like I know you really want to talk about this one thing, or people are always like, what color were Jesus' eyes, or just super random stuff. Like, but when you share your story, like this is the thing I really want you to hear.
Yeah. Um, I that's a great question. I think that people already are convinced that there is something on the other side. Most people, they don't know how to get from here to there. Woody Allen said, "I don't mind dying. I don't want to be there when it happens, though." That's part of the problem. And so I think what it comes down to is, for me, is there is hope. There is hope. There are people that are completely that their hope has evaporated long ago, but there is something there. And if you're an evangelical Christian, I don't really use that word very often, but evangelistic, I love that word, evangelistic, bringing people to Christ, and without a lot of baggage to it. And people are talking these days about deconstructing their faith and so forth. And I always kind of laugh and go, I never constructed it, honestly, a lot of that stuff. So I, I don't have a lot of deconstruction to go on. And so here's what it comes out that there is hope. Some of you have relatives that you're thinking they're going to heck in a handbasket. And you're saying, I'm saying to you, you might be surprised when we get there. For one thing, you will be surprised, guaranteed you'll be surprised. But I think now you want to be a minister of hope, not of accusation, not of legalism, not of this, but more of this, hugging. You know, I like to say, Shaun, that the best evangelists are friendly, open-hearted people. And when you see it that way, there's a whole lot of people out there that I never thought were open to coming to Christ. But as I'm living as a friendly, open-hearted person, there's almost nobody won't respond to that. I'm getting a little bit emotional here a little bit, but I know that what I just said there is absolutely the heart of God. Friendly, open-hearted, accepting people.
Well, pick your path. Yeah, you can go clean toilets like Steve and his friends did, and that certainly opens doors. And I can say, with my experience over the past 3-4 years with these near-death experience stories, everybody wonders what's on the other side. We all have a destiny that we know we're going to die someday, and this is a universal thing we all worry about, think about. Everybody's actually interested in near-death experiences, and so like again, I've just found even the most non-church, non-Christian people I encounter, if you strike up a conversation, they're curious about this stuff. They'll pick up a book and read about these experiences. And so, find a few near-death experience stories that you like and keep a few handy. So you would be amazed at the people God will set you down next to on an airplane or wherever you might go about your day and present opportunities. It can
Absolutely.
look like anything: cleaning toilets, sharing a book, striking up a conversation about a podcast you listen to. At the end of the day, I feel like a lot of it just comes down to loving people enough to care and seeing them and stepping into their world, and really,
Absolutely.
really through you, let Jesus impact them in that moment. Steve, in terms of us connecting with you, finding out more about ministry, books, all the
Yeah.
things, where do we discover you on the web?
Um, the very best place, I have several websites, but the very best place is Kindness Explosion. Think of it, kindness, boom, explosion.com. I actually worked in the mines in Arizona when I was in college, and I carried dynamite to all the miners. and had a blast doing it. But you think of Dynamite, Boom, and kindnessexplosion.com. And by the way, again, the toilet cleaning is more the heroic levels. We do a lot of regular stuff of, tipping a person at the drive-thru window. Have you been tipped lately? Never. This is going to be a thankless job. Here's $3, $5, whatever. And they'll, why? Who are you? Why are you doing this? That's an open door, folks.
Well, that's like JV level. You can start tipping better and letting them know who you are and why. If you want to go varsity level, start cleaning toilets. See what happens. We'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to any websites that have been mentioned. We'll link to places where you can pick up your very own copy of Steve's book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Steve Sjogren. Once again, our book today was The Day I Died, an unforgettable story of life after death. And Steve, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and truly a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, sir.